So we are going to move right to our next presenter. This is one of the presenters who you will have to imagine for just a moment while she comes on to visit us and give her talk. It actually is an interview that Jesse Cofino did with Dr. Mariana Brussoni from the University of British Columbia. And as you'll see, she focuses on risky play and the benefits of it for children. There's a delay in her arrival. Here we go.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mariana Brussoni, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but they wanted to give me the opportunity to share, and I'm so glad that I can do that even from Canada, from afar. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is my research program around risk and risk-taking in children's play, and really thinking about whether children are too safe for their own good. So one of the issues that we have, so I'm an injury prevention researcher and a developmental psychologist, and I'm a faculty member at the University of British Columbia and the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. I've been doing research on injury prevention for a number of years, and I've become increasingly concerned that some of our efforts at keeping kids safe are actually potentially doing more harm than good. And so my research program has really focused on how this is playing out and understanding children's natural need for risk and what it looks like when that doesn't happen and how we can make change. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. But first of all, touching on really getting into what are some of the reasons that we are so concerned about letting kids take risks? What are the fears and assumptions that really overwhelm us that make it hard for us to let go and let them take risks? And in terms of my own work with parents and early childhood educators and administrators and so on, there's been some really key themes that have come through in terms of what people tell me they're so afraid of. So for example, for parents, one of the big things is kidnapping and stranger danger. Their child getting hit by cars or having serious injuries. For educators and others, it's issues around liability. And then for parents, it's actually concerns about what other parents will think about them. So what we've been doing in our research program is to try and bust some of these myths, as well as give people tools to try and overcome these fears and kind of reframe their ideas of risk. But what I want to turn to now is actually do a bit of myth busting. So for example, as it relates first to stranger danger, and this is really the deepest fear of every parent, that this could happen to their child. But when in fact you look at the data, what you find is that stranger danger, so kidnapping by a stranger, is extremely rare. So I have some stats here, for example, that in Canada it's about 1 in 14 million. In the US it's about 1 in a million, and in the UK it's about 6 in a million. Now these numbers change because the definition of what it means to be taken by a stranger changes and the sources of data and so on. But what I want you to take home is that regardless of the definition you use, it's extremely rare. So as Warwick Carnes has said, that you would have to leave your child unattended for about 200,000 years before they would get taken by anyone, and then you would likely get them back. And so parents are really structuring and limiting their children's movements and lives at great fear of this happening, when in fact the likelihood is very low. And we're giving very little thought to the effect on kids when you have these kinds of limits set on them and how it affects them. So I want to just tell you a bit about that in a moment. But what I want to do now is actually move on to some other injury data. So what you have in front of you is a chart of Canadian child injury deaths from 1950 to 2010. And the dark line is boys and the red line is girls. And what you'll notice is that there's a really significant downward trend. And in fact, you've seen that we're actually almost also where boys and girls are very similar to each other. And so some of the key take-home messages here are, it's never been a safer time to be a child than it is right now. And so I've had people ask me, well, maybe, our approach to protection and risk is actually working. And keeping, overprotection is keeping kids safe. But in fact, if you look at these patterns, what you find is the leading cause of death for child injuries in Canada and in actually most of the world is traffic, kids in cars. And in fact, that was the case in 1950. It's still the case now. So when you look at the trends and patterns around the drop of injury deaths, what you find is the big drops result from policy change around traffic injury. So things like seat belts, anti-lock brakes, legislation around drunk driving, those sorts of things is what really brings things down. So it's not play that's actually causing kids to die, and never has been. And so in fact, our concerns are really overblown. And in fact, just to kind of emphasize this, I looked at data across Canada for falls, deaths from falls related to play equipment, and deaths from falls related to trees. And I tried to get like as much data as I could get. And what we found was that from 2007 to 2013, you've got about 49 million kids represented across all that time. There was one death in all that time of falls from play equipment. And for even a longer span, 14 years, there were 0 deaths from falls from trees. So I hope what will be clear to you here is that kids don't die from play, and it is really not an issue. So I want you to just show you a bit of data from other countries just to give you a sense of what's going on elsewhere. So for example, we have some data from child injury deaths from China, 2000 to 2015. And there's some very similar patterns there. We've seen that in that time span, injury deaths for kids have decreased by 2.5 times, a huge decrease. And just like Canada, road traffic crashes are one of the leading causes, as well as drowning, of death for Chinese kids. Those account for about 47% of injury deaths. So again, it's not really play that's causing these serious deaths and injuries. We also have, in terms of the WHO European region, there's also shows a 47% drop in child injury rates from 2000 to 2015. And just like we're seeing in Canada and China, the biggest gain in those drops is a result of motor vehicle crashes, okay? So when we look at other kinds of injuries, so when we're looking at things that don't lead to death, it's a little bit harder to get data from China. But I found a study that looked at about 11,000 kids in one of the provinces at a school in, or a province in China. And they looked at 5 to 19-year-olds, and they did a survey of the kinds of injuries that they experienced in the previous year. And what they found was that of these 10,927 kids, 5.2 reported actual injuries. And what those injuries consisted of? Well, about 73% were falls. Where did they happen? During recess, inside the classroom, extracurricular activities in phys ed, those kinds of things. Nothing surprising. But what happened? What was the resulting injury severity of those? Well, what we find is that 80% of them were considered minor, where in fact, there wasn't even missed school days. Another 15%, they missed, say, 1 to 5 days, and 4% missed 6 or more days. 1% were hospitalized. So what we see here is a very, very small number of injuries, and even less that actually result in anything resulting in hospitalization. So injuries should not be a concern for us. Now, one of the things these data don't tell us is how many injuries are there when you control for the exposure that kids have actually to a potentially injury-causing activity. So there was a systematic review done a couple of years ago where they looked across all the studies that included exposure time for kids that were 6 to 12 years old, and the studies that involved active commuting, so things like walking or cycling to school, sports participation, and play. And what they found was that play had the most number of injuries. But when you accounted for exposure time, it was actually the lowest by far. In fact, sports was the highest, and play had 0.15 to 0.17 injuries, medically treated injuries, which were usually minor, per 1,000 hours. So what does that mean? That translates to roughly a child would have to play for 3 hours a day for about 10 years before they log enough time to result in what is going to be a minor medically treated injury, you know, an ice pack from the nurse's office kind of thing. There was also research done by Ellen Setter and her crew in Norway, looking at injuries in early childhood centers. So they did a survey of all the early childhood centers, and a total of 2,000 of them, just 2,078 of them, responded that represented 95,000 kids. And their results indicate that there was about 0.16 injuries per child per year. And of course, the vast majorities of these were just like put a Band-Aid on it. And if you translate those data, there was one minor injury for every 8 children per year, right? So we're talking very, very small numbers, especially given how overproportionate our fear of these are. The other thing that I tell my injury prevention and public health colleagues is that we have a paradox here, that keeping kids safe means letting them take risks. So kids in engaging in risk are able to figure out how the world works, how their body works, how they can figure out their risk management skills to see how they keep themselves safe, not only in this situation, but how those lessons translate across to other situations. Now, we're not the only ones that have noticed the importance of this. So for example, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2013 wrote, "A balance is needed between, on the one hand, taking action to reduce the unacceptable hazards in children's environments, and on the other hand, informing, equipping, and empowering children to take the necessary precautions to enhance their own safety." So the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child is recognizing the importance of the child's agency and the ability to develop those risk management skills through these experiences. And in fact, the International School Ground Alliance, which includes people from across the globe, put out in 2017 a declaration on the importance of risk in play and learning. And you can find it online, but I'll just read a little quote for you, which was, "Risk-taking opportunities are an essential component of a well-functioning school ground. Adults and institutions have a responsibility to use common sense in providing, allowing risk-taking activities for children and young people." So there's this broad recognition that things need to change and that we need to get a bit more balance in what we're doing. And so in fact, what we're moving towards in injury prevention is an approach that sees having to keep kids as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible. So the other thing that we've been finding in this work is, you know, as risk exposure and outdoor playtime for kids has decreased over time, is that we have some suggestions about the potential consequences of this for kids. So for example, one of the things that we've been finding is that there are very serious and important consequences for children's bodies and their level of physical activity. So a global matrix is put out every couple of years looking at the physical activity level of children and youth across the world. Canada's grade is D-. It's not great. And China's grade is F. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But one of the things that's been identified across the world is the importance of kids being able to engage in outdoor play, and that be of their own free choosing. And it's really not just China or Canada that have these issues. So this Lancet study actually looked at trends across time from 1975 to 2016 in terms of children and adults' bodies and what their body mass index looks like. And what you'll see from this slide is that, in fact, it's increasing dramatically for both boys and girls across time. Everybody has a problem, and we all need to work towards changing it. And in fact, some research out of Canada that looked at children's bodies in 1981 and then again in 2007, 2009, 12-year-olds, found that Canadian children are getting taller and heavier. but they're also getting fatter, rounder, weaker, less flexible, and less aerobically fit than they were in 1981. And this trend is continuing. But it's not just children's bodies that are affected, it's also their minds. So there's more and more research showing how rates of anxiety and depression are just skyrocketing. And in fact, the rates that we're seeing now for quote unquote a normal population are at the level of what you would expect a psychiatric population in the 40s. So we have some serious issues. And in the words of Dr. Stuart Brown, who really saw that play and the absence of play was a real serious issue for this, he said, the opposite of play isn't work, it's depression. The other thing that we're seeing is in terms of creativity levels. So the Torrance test, which is a test which is used quite universally and has been in place since the 70s. So it's the same test across time. And some research looking at US kids in different time points. So 1974, 1980, 1998, and 2008. The results of that have seen that, in fact, while in the initial 8 years you saw an increase in creativity, there was a sudden really big drop-off from 1990 on. And the biggest drop-off was with our youngest kids, kindergarten to grade 3. And the next biggest was grades 4 to 6. So what's going on? And there's some suggestion that, in fact, kids' ability to just be able to use their own minds, be creative, and play in the way that they want to play is an important factor in this drop. Another interesting bit of research is actually around eye health and myopia, short-sightedness. And in fact, you'll see here that short-sightedness, the incidence has gone up dramatically across the world, but more so in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. So we're reaching rates of about 90% of myopia. And some research seems to show that one of the big things is actually not focusing into the distance and the light spectrum coming into the eye. And so, in fact, what's been suggested is that kids should be outside 3+ hours every single day in order to decrease the likelihood of myopia. So how do we change things? Well, there's 3 key ingredients to outdoor and risky play supportive environments, and you will have seen them in your touring of Angie Play sites. But there's really time, space, and freedom. And I want to touch on actually some of the issues that I've been working on, specifically around playground standards and how they have really constricted the quality of the spaces that kids have access to, and what those spaces look like, what they're allowed to do in them. And also how the use of standards for example, things like insurance has also influenced people's risk aversion, so that they don't want to have these liability issues. They think that they need to follow the standards and their insurance might require it. So some of the research, and we just put out a paper where we are looking at how standards should be used. And what we find is that the use of standards at this point in many countries, including Canada, the US, Europe, extends its actual purpose. So standards, playground standards, are very useful documents as engineering documents. So they should tell you, how you should anchor a piece of equipment into the ground, making sure that everything's welded into place, surfacing, those sorts of things. It should stop there. Unfortunately, the way they're applied is that you also have playground inspectors coming from afar who don't have pedagogical or child development knowledge, making value-based judgments around things like the kind of fencing that should be around a space, the affordances that space should have, the kind of loose parts and natural play features and so on that are acceptable. And those really are judgments that need to be grounded in the community that play is happening in. They need to consider the kids that play there, the context of that community, and their values. And so what we're proposing is we need to kind of split those two. So you have the standard-based technical facts, which deal only with the engineering aspects. And then you have the value-based judgments, which are guided instead by something like a risk-benefit assessment framework, where the play provider has the control and role of making those decisions rather than an external safety inspector or licensing officer. And so we're in Canada, we're currently developing a risk benefit assessment framework, and we're working with insurance to integrate that as a piece of what it looks like to have good play provision. But I'd also direct you, the UK, we're building on work out of the UK, and you can find this document online, Managing Risk and Play Provision, which is an excellent document in terms of giving you an idea of what risk benefit assessment should look like. So I'll stop there, and here's my contact information. I'm more than happy to connect with any of you. Please feel free to get in touch, and I'd love to hear how the conference went or if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.